What's the best I told you so moment? Before we start with the first story, please hit a subscribe and ring the notification bell to stay updated with us. Story 1. I was in freight. I delivered a pallet that was supposed to have 750 pieces. It looked a little short, so I asked the customer to count it. He refused 3 times after I explained to him, if it was short, they're going to deny your claim. He said, don't worry. I said, okay, and noted it on the paperwork that he refused to count. He signed it. 2 weeks later, he called the customer service rep to report a shortage and make a claim. The customer service rep called me and asked, did I remember it? I said, yep, read the notes. She said, oh, he refused to count it. Claim denied. Thanks, bye. LOL. Story 2. Ex-boss, who I was not fond of, had a vehicle he wanted to sell. He met someone who wanted to make payments on it, used private party, but take possession when they made the first payment. I told him not to do it. I said it was almost certain they will crash the car and then just stop paying, and he'll be left with a damaged car and no money. He told me I was dumb and went ahead with the deal. Okay, whatever you say. For a couple months, things were good and he was pretty smug. Then he comes in one day and tells me to research what happens if the above scenario happens, and the car was in a tow yard collecting fees. He wanted to know if he was responsible for the fees. Story 3. In the late 80s, I worked for my mill as a regional manager of her business. I worked very long hours for $500 per week. At some point, I told her that I deserved a raise. She asked me how much I thought that I deserved, and I replied that she couldn't replace me for less than $1,000 per week. She responded that she was sure that she could. So I said, fine, show me. She had trouble finding someone and finally had to pay the $1,000. But after 2 weeks, he was totally incapable of doing what I did. So she had to split it into 2 regions and hire a second guy at $1,000 per week. After 6 months, she discovered that they teamed up to embezzle about $15,000. Of course, she never acknowledged to anyone, especially not me, that I was right, and she f***ed up badly. Story 4. When I was in high school, 15 years ago, during a basketball game, the coach pulled me out and berated me for not boxing out the opponent for a rebound. I did box her out and I knew it, so I talked back to him. We really got into it. That really ticked him off, so I didn't go back in the rest of the game. The next Monday at school, he pulled me into his office and said he watched the game film over the weekend and apologized because I did indeed box her out. Story 5. As a teacher, telling the head principal at my school that the way they were abusing the alternate assessment program to boost standardized test scores was not just a huge burden on teachers, but also illegal and likely to attract the scrutiny of the State Department of Education. He handed me a shitty assignment for the next year. I quit, and he ended up having to take that assignment, teaching 16 kids with emotional disorders across 3 grade levels in one classroom for the first month and a half of the school year BC. They couldn't find anybody to take my place. I heard later that year that they came down hard on him for the scheme he'd concocted and ended up shutting down the alternative assessment program altogether. Told you so, DL. Story 6. Family friend's truck was making a grinding noise from the brakes. Told him to drive something else to go hunting. Got a call the next day because he drove it 2 hours and then his brakes stopped working. He ended up needing calipers on top of the pads and rotors he would have originally needed. Story 7. My dad had a rule that if he worked on the car, we had to be with him, use the manual, and help. He gave me the manual. The manual said it was the relay. I told him that. He said I read it wrong and didn't follow the if this then this correctly. We replaced the battery. It didn't start. We replaced the starter. It didn't work. We replaced alternator. It didn't work. We went to the repair shop. They replaced the relay. It worked. I loved my dad. I knew a bit more about cars and other household stuff than most girls, but Mom and I still have a laugh over that story and a clutch, which is a whole other story. Story 8. I started following when COVID started up in China. It was various stories coming out in bits and pieces, but if you were paying attention, then you knew something bad was up. This was early to mid-January. I started telling friends and family about it and saying they needed to start paying attention. They mostly thought I was being dramatic. Then when Italy shut down, they all started to notice. Story 9. When I lived in New Orleans, I knew this insufferably pretentious goth chick from Ohio, or someplace who was absolutely incapable of admitting she wasn't omniscient. She was fixing herself lunch and started blanketing it with cayenne pepper, and I warned her to watch out, since it really is spicy. She rolled her eyes at me, added a bunch more, took one bite, ran into the bathroom to barf, and didn't talk to anyone for like 2 days. Story 10. This is a bit of a silly one, but my brother was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from America, and the first time he flew out to see her, I jokingly told him that if he didn't impress the Americans, then they would throw him in the Thunderdome. He just laughed and told me that there was no such thing as a Thunderdome. Anyway, he flies out, and her town just happens to have an event called the Thunderdome. I rubbed that in his face for weeks after he came back. Story 11. When my younger brother fell through the ice while crossing a creek when we were kids, around 11 and 9, it was only slightly higher than knee-deep on us, and slow-moving, so not a high risk of drowning. However, a very uncomfortable 1/2 mile walk back to the house in 45F weather. I told him the ice was too thin to cross there, and we could cross maybe 300 feet upstream where it was ankle-deep water that was still frozen pretty solid. But I wasn't the boss of him. 4 steps later and he's up to his armpits, because he landed on his butt on the creek bed. What made it better was the entire whining walk home. He thought he would be in big trouble with my mom. However, one look at the waddling, pitiful mess, and Mom broke out in laughter as she helped him out of the clothes. It gets funnier. He was mad that she wasn't mad, and was shouting about how it's not funny and why isn't he in trouble? Isn't he grounded or something? Which leads to Mom running out of breath because she's laughing so hard now. He ends up storming to his room without being sent there. Story 12. I was a contractor managing stormwater ponds. Happy to field questions on the topic. Cattails are usually bad, because they grow so aggressively they'll clog inflow-outflow pipes and take up the flood storage volume. Also often are a monoculture with little ecological value. I had a manager I supervised who kept saying, "We don't have to sub that out to some company. I can rent an excavator and get all the cattails out, roots and all." He was a sketchy mechanic sort of character. Always had a MacGyver solution. Always was double-dipping with work equipment. I finally approved his scheme to rent a Mini X. Guess who gets a Tim? I f***ed up FaceTime 15 minutes later. Me. I drive across the state to get on site and see he submerged the excavator in the pond and ran it so water sucked up the intake. We had to daisy chain 2 50s to the tow truck to tow the f***ing thing 6 feet. He ended up buying it from the rental place and repairing it and flipping it. Story 13. Working at a tire shop. Customer bring in a Land Rover Range Rover with air suspension for a set of tires. I watch the tire changers start to set their little scissor lift under the frame to pick it up, and I go over and stop them. I tell them that they should take it down to the second drive-on rack and use the swing jacks under the axles, or else they're going to blow out the suspension. The assistant manager overhears this and comes out into the shop saying that I just called Land Rover, and they said that to turn off the air ride, all you have to do is open the rear hatch and turn the hazard lights on. Just pick it up where it is and get on with it. The customer's waiting. At that point, I said, "Well, you heard the man. I'm going to go back down by my toolbox. Holler if you need me." About a minute and a half later, what sounds like a shotgun blast is heard throughout the shop. They lifted the truck by the frame and blew out all 4 suspension airbags, just like I said would happen. They eventually wound up putting it on the drive-on lift and using the swing jacks, just like I told them to do. Then the customer got to drive all the way from Manassas, Virginia to Alexandria, Virginia, on the bump stops where the shop I was working for paid $6,000 for a set of used suspension airbags to be installed. God forbid the guy who's actually worked on Land Rovers before might know what he's talking about, even if I had only been at that particular shop for 3 days. At least they started listening to me when I told them stuff. Story 14. When I was 13 years old, I found out my brother was selling drugs out of my parents' house. He used to tell them he was giving away McDonald's coupons that he got from working the drive-thru. We lived in a very nice neighborhood, and I knew the influx of cars would attract police attention. After asking him to stop several times, I finally caved and told my parents. I was literally in tears because I felt guilty snitching on him, but felt like I had no other choice because he was going to ruin his life. When I told my parents, they accused me of being jealous of him for having better grades in school and called me a liar. He was able to continue on for 2 years before finally getting caught. Our home was raided and he was on the 5 o'clock news that evening. My mother watched and sobbed, and I couldn't help but say, "I told you," so what could have been an easy conversation ended in federal charges and several $100,000 in lawyer fees. Story 15. When I was waitressing in college, I got seated a man and a woman together for lunch. When I asked what they wanted to drink, the woman put down the drink menu, sighed, and said, "Just a water." The man ignored me and said something like, "And another thing," complaining about something loudly. He was switching from English into Spanish and back, and I just zoned out for about 30 seconds, until I asked if I should give them a minute to decide. Dude turns to me like he's just seeing me. I was 21, with a tanning bed tan and color and blonde hair. I also worked a double the day before. He smirks and says to the woman, "This is what I'm talking about. Look at her. I bet she doesn't know one question off the test, and she was born here. Why should I learn it?" The woman apologizes and explains they just come from taking the US naturalization test and they would both have waters. I grab their waters, and they are still arguing when I come back. I set the drinks down and turn to walk away when the man says, "Hold on." To his friend, he says, "No, I want to prove a point." He then turns to me and asks, "Do you think you could pass the test to be a naturalized US citizen?" I said, "Probably, but I know that I'd love to take their order for them." Guy wasn't happy. Anyway, I get it. Tests are annoying. But he's wired into it by now and finally stands up upset and says, "Fine, say the preamble to the Constitution." Fellow Americans who had an insane social studies teacher in 8th grade who made you memorize the preamble to pass their class, stressed about it and thought they'd never make it to high school. This one is for you. I hadn't thought of the preamble since then, probably, but baby, my public school, middle school, 8th grade teacher was right, y'all. I would need to know this important information later in life. It was my time to shine. I preamble the absolute shit out of that preamble. The preamble was preambling. Didn't even have to Schoolhouse Rock sing it. It was like those 52 words were now a part of my DNA. I also stood up straight and stared off at attention to nothing, which I'm sure added to this pinnacle of my college career. The woman clapped when I was done. The man sat down hard and turned away from me. I then looked back at them and said, "Now, can I please take your order?" It was perfect. A bald eagle landed on my shoulder. Uncle Sam cried, "Okay, no," but the woman said screw it and ordered beer and pizza while he sat angry and silent. I got $20 tip and the privilege of sharing this important information learned in school. Also on par with, but not quite as important as mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell. It was a good day. All right, folks, that's a wrap. If you like more of this, please hit a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can also share your thoughts in the comment below. I'll see you in the next video.